Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Different by design.
Different by design? What's that mean?
Gee, you guys might want to wait till I actually talk. You might want to rescind that applause. I'm Ross Van Overberghe. I'm the Historic Preservation Administrator. Kate and I today, we had this idea when we were asked to do this speaker series that we know that not all of these are Studebaker related, but we found that this is a kind of a weird intersection of automotive in a sort of way and historic homes. And so today we're presenting South Bend on the Move, From Tradition to Technology. This presentation follows the evolution of structure moving technology through the years, many of which those technologies were done here in South Bend. And you might be surprised at how many structures in South Bend actually aren't in their original locations. I might seem young, but I'm getting old enough to be technologically challenged now. So the history of moving houses and structures is a tale of ingenuity and adaptation, spanning from nomadic ancient lifestyles to modern structural relocations. Early humans, as nomadic hunters-gatherers, were constantly on the move, carrying their belongings, living in early, easy, transportable structures like tents or animal skin coverings. They just simply rolled them up, put them on their back, carried them to the next place. We don't think of that as relocating a structure, but it is. As we settled and became more sort of permanent, if you will, there began the need to move some of these more permanent structures due to various factors like urban development, natural disasters, or even the desire to preserve historic buildings. A quick timeline, and this I will preface with, this is sort of at each point when a new technology sort of emerged. What you'll find as we go through this is that most of these technologies or ways of moving structures didn't go away. So now we see combinations of the various items to make the best move. So early on, 2600 BC, ancient Egypt, evidence and theories have shown that it is mostly human power, maybe some animals using sleds and a wet sand method. Later on, as we get into the Babylonian era, they start using more animals and rollers, and now the introduction of pulleys and ropes starts to get to be used to help make that more efficient. By ancient Rome, 1st century of the Common Era, we see some mechanical stuff start to emerge, block and tackle systems with tread wheel cranes. Tread wheel cranes are the, think hamster wheel, somebody inside a wheel or people turning a wheel and using the leverage of that rope over the wheel to increase your lift power. By the 1700s, now that's a big jump. There's not a whole lot of evidence of what's happened between 100 and 1700, but most of it would have been about the same. But we see the block and tackle systems start to improve. Iron and better rope, steel cables start to emerge. In the early 1800s, we start to see wide-scale use of lifting jacks, screw jacks, and then animals and maybe even early steam power used to pull structures laterally. And in the mid to late 1800s is when a big development happens. Balloon frame construction, which made houses and structures lighter. The advent of manufactured nails and lumber made these houses easier to build, and they held together better than a lot of traditional methods when it came to needing to relocate. So we start to see moving of structures become commonplace. And then things accelerate at an astronomical pace. In the early 1900s to 1920, we see steam power heavily used. Cranes begin being used to lift and pull. We start to see steel replace the wood for the rails and the rollers. And then as gasoline and diesel power comes into place. The steam gets replaced because it's more efficient than steam. And we start to see hydraulics emerge in the form of hand-powered hydraulics, not what we think of today with moving. We see that start to appear in the mid-century, 1950s, 1960s, when you got to see large-scale mechanized hydraulic systems that could power many pumps at the same time. So now we've got synchronized jacks happening and moving. And then in the 1980s to 2000s, we start to see computer stuff get involved with calculating loads and moves, controlling the hydraulics. We see push-pull hydraulics on steel rails. We see the use of new technologies like Teflon for lubrication to ease friction. And in the 2000s to the present, the kind of the gold standard now for moving structures is what I like to call video game house moving or remote controlled house moving. But the technical term is self-propelled modular transporters. But they're a whole series, and we'll get into it a little bit later in a slide. But to give you an idea, what you'll start to see is a combination of different things. Hand-powered stuff combined with hydraulics, mechanics combined with lubrications and things like that. An interesting thing we had in our records were somebody had transcribed a bunch of the early building permits for the city of South Bend, and for an almost 7-year period, what we discovered is that of the 1,455 building permits that were issued, almost 17% of them were for structure moves, where it literally says, you know, move a structure from one lot to another lot. They used remove in kind of the same language as demolition, so we had to sift through ones that specifically said moving from a lot to another lot. There could very well be more where they just said, and we're going to remove this structure, but they didn't say where they were taking it to. So, you know, before the turn of the 1900s, there's a lot of houses being moved. I mean, this is, you know, think about it too, this is before, you know, cars or, you know, there's steam powers being used, but unless you're next to a railroad using you know, we might have used steam traction engines, things like that, but we'll get to that in a little bit later. So we start off with natural aids, frozen lakes, water, logs, anything that can be found in nature that can help. Animal fats as lubricant. I know it's bacon, but it looks better than, more appealing than a blob of white fat. And it's funny. Nobody's using bacon to move houses. Well, I don't know, you could pay people in bacon. They might, you know, move houses that way. So here's the first, you know, kind of major move in South Bend that uses a natural aid that a lot of people probably don't even know happened. This is the Water Street Bridge, what is commonly known as LaSalle Street now. This was a two-span truss bridge. It was built by the Lane Bridge and Iron Works of Chicago. What you can see here is the South Bend Woolen Mills. So this would be just after you cross the LaSalle Street Bridge. There's a brown building right there. That's what we'd be looking at. So we'd be standing on the north side of the bridge. So there was originally a wood structure here. It got deteriorated. The county finally hired Lane Bridge to make a steel iron structure. They had built it, part of it collapsed, they rebuilt it. This bridge was built in 1888, and eventually they reached the point where they figure it's not worth continuing to fix the iron. They want a more stable bridge, so they hired a new company that was actually building the new bridge that's still standing now, the Mellon Arch Bridge. But we can see in the newspaper article that they also were hired to move the truss bridge 4 miles upriver to an area called Mosquito Glen, which is basically where Darden Road crosses the river by Healthwind Hospital. So they talk about it. They actually did detach the structure from the piers, floated it up the river, and then reassembled it up there. This is an image from the Lane Bridge catalog where they actually showed the bridge they built in South Bend as an advertisement. Here's the bridge as it looked in the late 70s after it closed to automobile traffic. It actually was used it was the only other crossing. So you had LaSalle Street, and then 4 miles north was the next way to get across the river until they built the Cleveland Road Bridge. And then they started to abandon this because it had gotten so far in disrepair. In the 2000s, it got restored and put back into use as a footbridge. So a lot of people see this bridge, they think it's really cool. A lot of people don't know, it was actually the original bridge from 1888 that was here in downtown South Bend. Ice. This is the only case I know of, at least it's in Indiana, it's regional, it's not here. This is Lassen's Resort on Cedar Lake. If anybody's been down there, there's a Cedar Lake Historical Society that's based out of the Lassen Resort. The Lassens originally had just a dance hall pavilion that was actually floated out on piers. On the opposite side of the lake was the Armour Brothers ice harvesting complex. And they had built a boarding house. This back part here was actually the boarding house that the Armour Brothers used for all their workers when they came to harvest ice. The Lassen brothers bought it, waited till the lake froze over, put it on sleds, and there's multiple stories whether it was animals or whether it was actually traction engines or diesel tractors, but it was pulled across the lake and set on the other side of the lake, and then they used lumber from the rest of the ice house complex, ice harvesting complex, to actually build this front part and the porch for what then became their hotel and restaurant for a long time and is now still standing as the museum. The right to move. This is another one that I love to stump people with in South Bend. They don't realize that the 1855 courthouse originally sat in the location on Main Street facing east, where the new courthouse is, the current courthouse is. That's where the first courthouse was. They tore that one down to build this one. So this is Courthouse 2, or the second courthouse. They were going to tear this down to build a new one, but decided, yeah, it's still a good building. We can save it. So they jacked it up, put it on beams and logs, and rotated it 180 degrees to place it where it sits now, facing Lafayette Street. Here's a picture of how it sat on Main Street. Here we see the original jail that sat kind of in the middle of the block, and directly behind here would have been the sheriff's house that faced Lafayette Street. So as we move out of, and I say move out of, but again, keep in mind, we still utilized any kind of method we could to move structures. So we move into the era of using animals, horses and oxen, lots of human labor, but we also start to use carriages, wheels, rails, screw jacks, cribbing, anything we can to aid in the moving of these structures. So I throw this in there because I think it's fascinating that even this is on YouTube. This is probably fairly recent that this happened, but you know, groups who don't use technology in their lifestyle still find ways to relocate structures. You just need a lot of hands and feet. I find it fascinating because when you first see the video start, you're like, oh, okay, it could be like 10 by 20. And then as they start to turn it, you realize this thing's like 70 feet long.
How heavy was that bar?
I don't know that
How long?
I would assume based on just general, my guess would be probably about 30 or 40 feet wide by maybe 100 feet long. And I have no idea how heavy it is. I mean, but based on the number of feet that you could see, I mean, they supported it all the way across, and then everybody lifted up on the beam at the same time. All right. So again, you know, I can't say for sure whether anybody's moved a barn or a house in South Bend that way, but it's feasible. This is a story, I include this here, and I know we get out of South Bend and other parts of the country, but it goes to show that even if we don't have a documented case here, these are, you know, really showing the technology and the ingenuity for doing things. This is the Samuel Brown house. He was I think he was a revolutionary, no, maybe Civil War general or a sergeant, built this house, loved it. It's in Pennsylvania, was in Pennsylvania, but the railroad was right in front of his house, and they needed to expand, and they wanted to tear down the house. And he loved it so much, he didn't want it torn down. So they wanted to move it. It sat at the bottom of a 168-foot hill. So they lifted it straight up and then moved it back 500 feet to get it out of the way. And now this is in thought I had that date somewhere, 1906, 1907. So no cranes, anything. They used screw jacks, lifted it up, manual power, lifted it up, put cribbing underneath, repositioned the jacks, lifted a little bit more, lifted it all the way up. And at the very top, you can kind of see sitting on the cribbing is the rails that they use then to slide it backwards. And we don't have any of the technical data for how they moved it backwards, but essentially it could have been a team of animals on the other side of the house pulling it further onto the cliff. They could have used capstans or winches or any of the other manner of mechanical advantages. But this, you know, really goes to show that anything was doable, even at that point in time without the technology. Here's some ads from the time period where they really show that not only did they have various models of jacks for lifting screw jacks and other kinds of jacks, but they had traversing jacks. So you could lift something up and then move it sideways after you already lifted it up. So they already had, you know, and this would have been used for anything, not just houses. I mean, if they had big machinery or equipment to move, they were already thinking of ways to make it easier to move something. About that same time, we see this sort of intersects the screw jacks with balloon frame housing that I talked about earlier. Chicago, Illinois, if anybody knows about Chicago, is actually, the word Chicago is the natives at the time that was like swampland. That's what it meant in the translation. But most of Chicago was built, it sat low. They had all these buildings and houses that had basement levels, and the streets were low, and they were prone to flooding all the time. The basements flooded, the streets flooded. This is before sewers, so you can imagine this is just a disgusting situation. They start to realize they need to do something about this. So entire blocks of Chicago were lifted by screw jacks and had more foundation put under them so that they could be higher, because the city of Chicago had decided the best way to deal with all of the sewage and the flooding is to raise all the streets 6 feet. So if you didn't move your house, now you had a subterranean floor that wasn't really a basement. It was originally the first floor of your house. Now it's below grade. So a lot of people paid to have their houses moved up. And Chicago ended up being one of the kind of most widespread use of screw jacks in unison, lifting entire buildings and blocks all at the same time. Then we move into somewhat of the modern era of machines. I say that machine or mechanical advantage kind of can go both ways. You know, block and pulley is a mechanical advantage. It might not be considered a machine, but I guess it depends on who you want to argue the definition with. But this is when we really start to see power helping greatly in these big moves. Now we're using less teams of human labor or animal labor in favor for obviously diesel machinery or gasoline machinery. Steam engines, steam winches, and hydraulics start to emerge. This is back in South Bend. Be curious if anybody knows what house this is. Or you could go both ways. You could either tell me where it sits right now or where it was moved from. I won't keep you guessing for too long. This was originally 528 North Main Street. Sat just about across the street from the Masonic Temple. And it needed to be moved. It was going to be torn down for expansion and the change of the road. And it ended up getting moved to 709 West Washington Street, where it still sits today. It's right next to the Frank Lloyd Wright House. But this is a perfect example of the widespread use of the truck and dolly system. This is what I think most of us commonly think of now when we think of houses moving. Probably saw many of these moved in South Bend this way. Now, this is also where I was referring to this combination of two different types of systems being utilized. So we've got the mechanical power of being able to pull this on rollers and dollies that are easier to roll than, say, logs. But you also still have either hydraulic jacks or screw jacks when you're preparing the house and you're lifting it up and putting it on beams so that you can get the dollies underneath there. So you're still using wood for cribbing, you're still using, hand-powered jacks maybe to lift the structure up, getting your dollies under there, and then now it's like a trailer. You can drag it just about anywhere that you have room. So here's a shot of it coming up Lafayette Street, going the wrong way on the one-way street back then. You see the Tribune building here, the corner. And so, it was, and I say it's simple, it was as simple as getting it up on the wheels and then pulling it wherever you wanted it to go. And here's a close-up of, those dollies sitting underneath the structure, and kind of a illustration or a early photograph of this was specifically made for moving structures. So now we've got companies who are manufacturing items specifically for moving structures. Here we see the most recent move last May, where we see a loader used with a dolly system to pull into our cabin over here to the museum grounds. A little bit easier, it's not as heavy. I mean, it is all logs, but it's not bricks. Anybody recognize this building? So this is the South Bend Remedy building. It originally sat at 220 LaSalle. So basically where the Tribune's press building was expanded to. It was threatened then, but not by the Tribune actually. I don't think they were the ones expanding. I can't remember who was expanding, but it was threatened with demolition. One of the local movers who has done a lot of moves in the neighborhood or in town stepped forward and acquired the building, found a lot for it, and at his own expense moved it to the new lot. Here it is being moved past our Morningside Hotel that used to be on the corner of William and Colfax. So it's on its way down where it finally gets set on an empty lot next to the Birdsell Mansion, corner of William and Colfax. Interestingly, I think there was some controversy over it being too close to the Birdsell Mansion. I think there was some tension between whether it should stay there because it never got unbanded. The steel cables and plywood that were around this building stayed on it for like 15 years. And it sat there forever until it needed to be moved again. And so then it was decided that it was going to get moved. Here's some images of the second move where it's moved from Colfax over to West Washington. Here we see the Rushton building, corner of Washington and William. the building coming by it. You see in comparison to the Navarre cabin and the number of dollies that were underneath that to support its weight, and this stone and brick building and the number of dollies that are put underneath this building to support its weight and balance it out. But it eventually ends up getting moved to the corner of Franklin and Washington, where it sits now and is being happily used and is a happy building again. Moving on to remote-controlled hydraulics, the self-propelled modular transporters. This is the Polidor House, another recent move last year. This was on Marion and needed to be moved out of the way for the memorial expansion. We were fortunate enough for Indiana Landmarks to be able to work out a deal to get the house and pay for the move. They acquired a lot in Chapin Park right on Navarre and Portage. And Wolf Movers came in and they do the usual. They use hydraulic jacks to lift it up. They still use traditional cribbing. You'll see that in the next slide. They get it up on their beams. They get it on their dollies. Now their dollies are remote controlled. So instead of pulling it with a truck or a loader, this unit right here is a diesel motor that powers hydraulic motors that drive the wheels, turn the wheels, level the structure. So everything's controlled, and it's actually driven and controlled by a guy walking around with the controls with joysticks, moving it, playing his video game, driving houses down the street, because like it's a normal thing. We have more video and stuff of this one. This is why I included this. This is the May House north of this got moved in 2022. This is north of Memorial Hospital, where it sat, where it was built. This was moved up the hill into Chapin Park, and so this was also able to be saved. Wolf Movers also did this. Here's an example of where they come in, they punch holes in the foundation, they cut holes so that they can slide these beams in, and then they cut holes in the other way and they slide the bigger beams across. And working from the basement, then they start to build up the cribbing till they get up to the bottom of their beams. They then go in and they put all of these shims underneath the sill so that they make sure that the house is tight to the beams that they put in. They put hydraulic jacks on the top of their cribbing. They lift up the house a little bit. They slide in more cribbing. They set the house back down. Then they move their jacks up and they keep lifting it up all at the same time. The interesting thing I found compared to some other scenes that I've seen is that, and I hadn't seen this before, this move, the foundation's still down there. They bring in dirt and fill the whole basement in so that they now have a ground level to roll their dollies in on. They don't have to run beams across the opening of the basement. So they've actually just filled in the basement at this point. Then they can bring their dollies in, attach them to their beams, get them all lined up, and then they can just drive off the lot as if it was a flat lot. They don't worry about the foundation in the basement. It's all covered up with dirt. And this is a time-lapse video we took, and it's sort of amazing to see how simply the house just drives down the street, turns the corner. And then here, I'll point out, this is where I find this technology, this self-propelled modular transporters. They can move this within millimeter precision to get these houses where they need. They can also turn all of these wheels and dollies, as you'll see here. They get to here, and they can just turn them all and start driving the house sideways. And then as it goes up the curb here and up the incline to get over the beams to settle over the new foundation, you'll notice the hydraulics in the back start to lift higher to keep the house level.
Is that man, is a human doing that?
Some of it is computer assisted to keep to a level, but they do have ultimate control. And then I'm gonna have Kyle replay this one so I can point out something else. So you'll see there's a guy, you got a guy that's kind of measuring things, but there's a guy over here, you'll see him walk for a second. He's kneeling down. This is the guy with the remote control. That's it. Yeah, and then they just do the reverse. They set it down, and they slowly drop it down until the beams are sitting on cribbing, and then they get to the point where they can put it and set it on the actual foundation. They slide their beams out, they pull their cribbing out.
Was the cribbing taken from the other site, or did they build?
No, they build new cribbing because, and you know, that was a time lapse, but I will say that they started, I think it took them a total of maybe an hour and a half to drive it. That includes stopping to do a little bit of extra trimming on trees. And I didn't get it on the time lapse or the video, I was at the top of the hill, but when they turned from Lafayette to Riverside, they had to go over a curb a little bit. They couldn't quite make the turn. And if you were to see it, the house stayed level and the wheels came up over the curb and went back down because that leveling just stayed. I should say, like, most of these moves, there's no damage done to the houses. In fact, even back, the Samuel Brown house, I forgot to mention, that one was moved by hand with the screw jacks up the 168 feet and back 500 feet. They didn't even break a pane of glass. So I mean, it is pretty amazing. This is another technology. This is the merger of several technologies. This is where I start to, was talking about how we start to see many of these come together. So this is out in Martha's Vineyard. This lighthouse was in danger of the eroding cliffside. So it ends up getting moved back, but instead of just picking it up and putting it on cribs or on dollies and driving it, which they when they're weighing out, how do we move this structure? Now this is a tall vertical thing. It doesn't have a lot of stability, high center of gravity. If you pull it on wheels with a truck, if you don't get it just right, this thing's tipping over and it's done. So they figured out the best move for this was to set up steel beams in a long rail system and use hydraulics to do a push-pull method of moving this lighthouse, which you'll see in this video. So you'll notice a couple of things. He's spreading some kind of a lubricant. It's more petroleum based now than animal. It's not bacon grease. But you'll see too here, they clamp these and then they push the structure. Then once they've gone the distance that they can with the hydraulics, they unclamp them and then they pull the pads behind, clamp them back down, and now they can basically push it forward. So they can push it forward a bit, pull the hydraulics back with them, climb it back down, push it forward, so it sort of inchworms along. And in this way, they're able to move it so smoothly and incrementally without any sudden jerking that they don't have to worry about toppling this, the structure. So that's a combination of rollers and lubricants on a steel rail. And this is where you start to see these moving companies, even with all this new technology, it starts to take a combination of all of the different technologies together to figure out based on what the structure is that has to be moved. This next is one of my favorite unique moves. This is in Indianapolis. This is the Indiana Bell Telephone Exchange. So this original building was built in 1907. But by 1930, they had run out of space. They needed to expand, so they wanted to add on. Now, the original idea was, let's tear this building down and build a bigger building that fits everybody we need in it. The architecture firm hired to work on this was the Vonnegut, Bond, and Mueller architecture firm, which was Kurt Vonnegut Sr. And grandfather. So if anybody's heard of Kurt Vonnegut, the author, he wasn't moving places. His father was, and his grandfather. But his father had the idea, well, why get rid of this perfectly good building that we've got? We just need to rotate it so that we can build the addition next to it. And then we don't have to lose all of the connectivity of the services. We don't have to interrupt service for the telephone exchange. So again, this is a combination of human, so we've got a line of laborers. They have hand-operated pump hydraulic jacks. We're operating on steel beams that are on top of steel rollers that are on top of a wooden structure below. But I'll point out this. In some cases, they attached up to 200 feet of additional flexible cable and piping to the building. They never disconnected any of the services. Telephone service stayed in function. The sewers, the water, the gas all stayed connected, and all of the employees and customers could come in and out of the building at any given time because they had this arched walkway made. They never ceased operations. People in the building said they never felt the building move the whole time they were still coming to work and working. And here's a time lapse. Well, it's not really time lapse, it's multiple photos because they moved it 40 centimeters per hour. And then here's a close-up. So we've got a hydraulic pump jack, human power with a lever. Here's a steel beam. Here's the steel rollers. They would move it forward, and just like either the Egyptians or any of the early moves where they were using logs, as soon as they rolled off the log at the end or the roller at the end, another worker would grab that steel roller and walk it all the way around to the front of the beam so that it could go on to the next one. So they're using an ancient technology combined with other things to make this ingenious move without disconnecting anything. I'm going to turn this over to Kate. She's going to talk about why and if we should move.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how a historic building can be moved, but we should also just discuss, should a historic building be moved? Despite moving buildings being very commonplace, as we've learned in the 19th and 20th century, in fact, we have some primary sources from the 1840s when city living is just sort of burgeoning in the United States. We're moving out of an agricultural era and into a city era where this woman, I forget her last name, a city housewife writes in her diary that as absurd as it is to see chimneys walking down the street, it's more insane to deny the sheer number of them that you see going past your front door and moving different places in these burgeoning cities and towns. Even though we've had that history of moving buildings being very common, it's not always been a very obvious or easily attainable strategy today. In terms of city planning, historic preservation, which we do day in and day out, or even for just a regular person who doesn't want to lose their house to various developments. In fact, in today's construction practices, construction industry, supply chain, utilities hookups, flat work, etc., it can be quite expensive and add up fairly fast. So you think of it now today as a last resort most of the time. We're looking at it as something quite unique and special. And especially if you see today the moves that Ross showed you, the videos that we've taken in the past, whole crowds of people show up to watch these buildings move down the street. And as a preservation strategy, it has its fair share of criticism. For instance, lots of critics will respond that there's a risk of fabric loss, a risk of the original structural materials, the integrity. Even though we are very careful when we move buildings, you're spending a lot of money, there's a lot of great technology. People will say, well, what if something happens? What can happen? They'll also say, there's a loss of the building's context, its setting, its landscape. What was it originally built for? Was it a barn or was it a townhome? And then lastly, caution from official guidance and regulations from the last 100 years of historic conservation, historic preservation, heritage thought, policy, and law. So first off, considering structural integrity. It's very safe generally, but what can go wrong if something, God forbid, were to go wrong? Think about things of sloping floors, sagging floors, cracks in the window or in the window panes, windows that stick shut if they're old windows, if the frame itself has shifted in the move, cracks in walls and ceilings, a variety of things that are falling off, piping, etc. A few factors that can contribute to this. The weight of the home may be unevenly distributed as it's put up on dollies, misplaced equipment perhaps, strain on the structure at various points. Lifting the house too quickly can also result in issues. And then some structures are generally overall easier to move than others. You have to take into account the current structural soundness, how heavy it is, how large is it. Are you going to have to do any shoring up of the structure prior to the move itself? And then I thought this was just a funny photo of an intentionally wonky house built in Poland in 2004. In terms of illustrating context and setting, I think one of the most explicit ways to illustrate this is by looking at one of the most famous houses in America, or one of the most famous architects in America. This is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. It was built between 1936 and 1937. It includes multiple cantilevered outdoor terraces that connect to this large chimney here with no additional support on the other side, and then positioned over this waterfall and in a wooded setting. On the concept of landscape, Frank Lloyd Wright was a gifted architect in taking into account the setting of his homes, the surrounding of his homes, reflected in the design and in the interior of the homes that he designed. And the National Trust on the topic of landscape and setting had this to say in 2002. The historical value of a historic home is more than simply the sum of its structural parts. Of almost equal importance is the building's relationship to the surrounding landscape, its sense of place within the larger community. Even the most carefully planned and executed relocations, some of the building's historic integrity is inevitably compromised. And they're pretty explicit. It's not just the structure that matters. Consider a mid-century ranch home built in a subdivision with wide, sprawling streets, big yards, picket fences. Would you move that to, say, Chapin Park, a side street on Chapin Park with its brick roads, 1880s houses, vernacular architecture, very tight and compressed in terms of neighborhoods today? Or perhaps a barn being moved from its homestead location somewhere else. And so Falling Water, while being an explicit example of this is the scene that everyone thinks of, this is what matters, would it still be as well known and as important if it were in the middle of Philadelphia? Third thing that I want to bring up is regulations and expectations. Everything that Ross and I do as staff at the Historic Preservation Commission is informed by a century plus of theory, guidance, guidelines, policy, laws, etc. The official who, say, and what of the field. I've chosen to outline just a few things here, but do keep in mind that it is a very broad, fascinating topic of academia. So the International Council of Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, the first convening of this, a series of international charters and conservation convenings, the first one being in 1965. What came out of this series of meetings was a set of documents and 16 principles to guide architects, engineers, preservation specialists in the appropriateness of how to conduct business and preservation. And of principal importance, according to ICOMOS, is the concept of authenticity. For instance, in this initial 1965 document, reconstruction not permitted. Materials must be respected. Any new elements must be distinguished from the original elements. There can be no matching, trying to make things look old. It has to be authentic, and part of that is respecting what's new and what's old. In terms of setting, Article 7 of this original ICOMOS document explicitly bans the relocation of historic buildings. They state, a monument is inseparable from the history to which it bears witness and from the setting in which it occurs. The moving of all or part of a monument cannot be allowed, except where the safeguarding of that monument demands it. And then hot on the heels of that international charter was the National Historic Preservation Act in the US in 1966. This created multiple avenues of preservation in the United States in terms of recognition on the federal level, including the authorization of the National Register of Historic Places, as well as review processes like the Section 106 review process. In terms of eligibility for National Register of Historic Places, if you are moving a building that could be eligible, or is on the National Register, you do have to consider, is the move going to jeopardize the current listing or my eligibility to be listed? And this is the main avenue for getting access to grant funding for preservation in the United States. You do not want to be told you can't be listed on the National Register. For example, a property that has been removed from its original location can still, in cases, be eligible for National Register, provided that it's eligible under certain categories. It has to be architecturally eligible, so category C, architecture, or it has to be the sole surviving property, most importantly associated with a historic person or event. So there's no other property that can illustrate the importance of, say, Abraham Lincoln. We have to move this building, but it's the only thing we have left to tell us about his life and story. The newest orientation as well, the setting, should be comparable to its original location. You cannot, as I mentioned earlier, do this. And an artificially created group of buildings, such as Greenfield Village in Dearborn, cannot be eligible unless it has achieved significance since the time of its assemblage, which Greenfield Village has and is on the National Register, but not for its individual parts, for the sum of what was created in Dearborn. Additionally, the National Register enables Section 106 review. This is a review process that guides federal agencies to take into account the effect of their undertakings on properties that are eligible for or included in the National Register. So if there's any sort of roadwork projects, federal improvements, things of those sort, that triggers this to start. This is the Section 106 review process specifically lists the removal of a property from its historic location as an adverse effect that should be avoided if at all possible. While this is all happening, and while ICOMOS is banning removing a building from its original context, the National Register is talking about eligibility and its criteria depending on setting. The planning scene in terms of city planning and preservationists who are accounting buildings being demolished, torn down, threatened by development, start to push back on this a little bit. And the city of Eugene in 1979 publishes a planning document called Old Houses Make Good Neighbors. They start to argue that even though removing a building from its original context may have damage to its historic integrity, its authenticity may be compromised, we may lose some original historic fabric or material, we don't want to incrementally lose so much of our neighborhoods that they themselves become unlivable or completely divorced from their original history. There is an alternative to demolition, to clearing things, to shiny and new, an alternative to urban renewal, which was so prevalent in the mid-1900s. Because ultimately, we have lost an incredible amount of architecture in our cities, in cities in the Midwest, and cities across the country. These are all buildings that used to stand in South Bend. These are just a fraction of the buildings that we have in our files at the Historic Preservation Commission, the buildings that are documented here at Studebaker, that we no longer have access to, that no longer make up our urban fabric, our environment, our cultural history, and our buildings history. We also have this very lovely graphic that Ross made about all of the building moves that we are currently aware of in South Bend. There are more than this. Even as we were driving around today for some meetings earlier, we were noticing more that we had neglected to put on this. But this is only what we can know of as of now. There's, like I said, of the 1,400 roughly building permits in 1890 to 1896, 147 or so of those were building moves. That's just a 6-year period, 7-year period in the late 1800s. This is a very commonplace practice, and our entire urban landscape has been changed from it. It is a great preservation tool if you can afford it, if it's feasible, and as a last resort, it makes sense. We would rather have buildings that move around than a landscape that is devoid of historic buildings. Thank you.
Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker.